Happy 1-year anniversary of the Sonic movie. I'm absolutely ecstatic that that's the last movie that I got to see in theaters until COVID happened. If it came out again, I'd watch it today. But regardless, because it's Valentine's Day, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of books that I love, or am in love with. I feel like in left-wing circles, especially among like a whole bunch of eggheads who've read like a trillion books, there's a whole lot of focus on this or that country or this or that time period, rather than groups of people or even individual people and their personal experiences and relationships they developed during or as a part of revolution. If we're like socialists, then we should be social and we should investigate relationships between people. That's why a whole lot of these books are biographies, because I'm not that interested in the grander scheme of things, but on a smaller, more personal level, for Valentine's Day, of course, what do people feel and experience and go through in revolutionary situations? Without further ado, let's jump right into it. All right, first book is going to be John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World. Those 10 days took place during the Russian Revolution. There was also a movie adaptation that came out shortly after. I think you can still find it on YouTube. And John Reed was an American socialist and journalist who kind of toured the world looking for revolutions. He also had a book written about the Mexican Revolution, which took place in the 1910s during and after World War I. This one, though, was about the Russian Revolution, and he's actually buried at the Kremlin Wall necropolis for it. According to Vladimir Lenin and Fidel Castro, this is like the best version of like the personal story of the Russian Revolution. And when I say personal story, I don't just mean that it's like his version of the story. It says a whole lot about the political phenomena and how the individual revolutionaries taking part in the revolution were a part of that. But it also talks about like how they're everyday people struggling for survival. And it kind of reads like an epic. So it falls into like the same sorts of patriarchal traps, but if you can look at it as a piece of history and you can make sense of those patriarchal political phenomenon, then it's a really good read. It's an epic like adventure kind of story, which is kind of funny talking about it in the time and place that it was. And it's very enthusiastic. It's very endearing how John Reed can take the situation that he was put in, which was terrible, but he's still like, this is our revolution, we're going to stick with it, we're going to nurture it. And so for that, it's just a really good classic read. All right, book number 2 is American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Herbert A. And it was required reading to be a Black Panther. This was on like the whole list. There were a bunch, but it is exactly what it sounds like. American Negro Slave Revolts. It was all of the like very violent acts of resistance that slaves waged against their slave holders. Slavery is a system that comes with slave revolts. You can't take slavery and slave revolts apart. If you have one, you have to have the other. It starts with talking about what kinds of people were involved in the slave revolts in general, what their historic situation was, what their material conditions were like, and then it breaks it up by time period. So it is talking about like the very big ideas, but it approaches them, in my opinion, in a very like human way, talking about who led what and like why, what kinds of things instigated it, what relationship the slaves had to each other. And for that, like, it kind of reminds me that just like how not every slave revolt overthrew slavery, not every anti-capitalist resistance is going to overthrow capitalism, but they're all heroic in their own right. And that is the reason that I'm in love with this book.
Like, we don't learn about slave revolts. I'm trying to think of a time when I have in my education. I don't think I ever have.
You might have heard of Nat Turner, and Nat Turner's was one of the bigger slave revolts, but they don't teach you about all of them because they want to sell you the classic slavery wasn't going to end until this white guy walked along narrative, which is absolutely not true. If you can actually read like old biographies of Northerners going to the South, like antebellum America, and they walk around like everybody's like clutching their purses, like everybody's got a gun. Like, this is really scary, and it's because there were so many slave revolts. You can't keep people in a place of such terrible subjugation, of such horrible, inhumane subjugation for a long period of time and expect a stable system.
Action.
Book number 3. Asada and Autobiography, the autobiography of Asada Shakur. Asada Shakur is a Black woman who lived in the South and migrated... Asada Shakur is a Black woman who lived in the South, migrated to the North and found out that it wasn't actually that much better. The problems with racism that existed in the South were in the North as well. Like, who figured? She's really important, and this book is really important because she talks about not only her revolutionary activity, what her opinions on other revolutionaries were, her relationships, and stuff like that along the way, but she also talks about skipping rope and the types of songs that she sung with her friends at school. She has a very important perspective. The treatment of Black women who were also post-civil rights Black activists, like, it wasn't that great, even within the organizations they existed in. She, for example, was in the Black Liberation Army, which did have a chauvinism problem. There was a lot of misogyny, unfortunately. She talks about how the police, back in her day, were Sieg Heiling to each other. These days, they just wear the thin blue line patches and hope that you pick up the message. But that's what they were doing back in her day. A lot of the problems that she talks about are very relevant to our time, not just with America generally, but with the leftist movement against capitalism and fascism, white supremacy as well. She talks about how white leftists behaved, just for example. Actually, one of the reasons that the embargo hasn't ended between the United States and Cuba is because she's there. One of the conditions for breaking the embargo between the United States and Cuba, on the United States part, of course, is Cuba giving back all of the political prisoners, many of which were Black activists that fled there. But Cuba doesn't want to do that. And she's alive there still today, still fighting. And she's actually also going to be in this next book that I'm going to mention. But at the end of the day, Asada and Autobiography is important to me because Asada's story is important to me, and everybody should read it. Next book is Black Power Afterlives. This book came out fairly recently, and it's about the Black Power activists, specifically those who were in the Black Panthers, after they stopped being Panthers. 1982 marked the end of the Black Panthers. Their last physical building was closed, but you can't stop the fact that all of these people had relationships, experiences, they educated themselves, agitated other people, they organized in lots of other organizations, and they never lost those experiences. You can't get rid of that kind of revolutionary fervor in somebody after they've already been through the absolute worst of it. A lot of the folks that were in the Black Panthers are still activists today.
Wait, sorry, when does this take place?
Anywhere from 1983 till today. Is when it takes place. Okay. It's an anthology of the continuing experiences of Black Panthers and their continuing fight for self-determination. A lot of them also have criticisms of their previous organization. Some of them even ended up becoming Buddhists or Muslims and take the same revolutionary energy they had before into other parts of their lives and people around them's lives. And at the end of the day, this book is about Fred Hampton's old phrase that you can kill the revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. You can't kill the relationship that people have with their past. Everything is shaped by what came before it and shapes what comes after it. And this is just an example of that.
Sorry for my stupid question. I feel like I'm just conditioned to hear Black Power and Black Panthers and think that was a long time ago.
Oh yeah, it really wasn't.
Just
this one is a thick boy.
What book you got there? Sorry.
This is My Life by Fidel Castro. It's a thick boy. It's 560 something pages. It does have pictures to help drag it along, but it's about Fidel Castro's entire life. There's stuff about the baseball cards he collected as a kid. There's stuff about his rebellious childhood and the type of life that he lived growing up. There's stuff about him even getting captured by Batista's regime before the revolution. His relationship with Evo Morales and other revolutionaries from Latin America is in here. Honestly, it's worth reading if you just want to know what the Cold War was like from Latin America's point of view, or at least this part of Latin America's point of view. There's a lot of very humanizing stories that he tells about revolutionaries like Che or Hugo Chavez and other people that really take those myths of our past, our mythical view of people, and takes them down to just being regular people. For that, I love this book. It's a great one. Read it if you have the patience.
Never. Communism's bad.
My favorite part of this book is probably Fidel Castro and the Cuban people making their way past the economic catastrophe that was the end of the Soviet Union. They had a shortage of all kinds of products that would normally be considered here kind of whatever. We take them for granted here in the States and many other industrialized countries. But they had to grow food out of every possible crevice and every nook and cranny they had to make use of. And the fact that the revolution continued all kinds of brutal attacks from the absolute most powerful nation in this planet's existence, basically, is just really endearing to me. I am biased. I read this immediately after reading Open Veins of Latin America. There are graphic depictions of torture and all kinds of horrible crimes, colonialism, conquistadors, all of that. So after reading that book, this one is a whole lot happier, in my opinion. Actually, there's a part that I didn't talk about. In Fidel Castro's autobiography, there's a little tiny anecdote he gives where he says that a lot of the folks who lived around where he lived, who couldn't read or write, asked other people to write love letters for them to give to their, crushes. And I think that's kind of relevant to Valentine's Day. Next book is Why Marx Was Right by Terry Eagleton. Terry Eagleton is a English professor from the UK, and he has just a kind of a linguistic flourish that I don't hear anywhere else. And every chapter starts with, oh, this and this and this is what Marxism is about. And then he just kind of does a whole myth busting as the rest of the chapter. So it'll say something like, doesn't Marx say a whole bunch of stuff about how the government should own things? And Terry Eagleton's no, but with all of these really fun and cool examples that don't make it seem condescending, and it's very approachable. And I just think that the idea of a Marxist Mythbusters is really neat. So that's why I love this book.
He's like the Hank Green of communism.
He's like the Hank Green of communism. Yeah,
I think Marx was right because he's just really hot and awesome.
True.
And that's just how I feel.
Honestly, what I would give for those feet pics. Red Rosa, last book. This one is the only comic book here. It's a fantastic one. It's got really good art. It's very approachable. There are sexual themes throughout the book. So there's a warning. Rosa Luxemburg is a Polish revolutionary from the early 20th century. There was a German Revolution that happened right after World War I that nobody ever talks about for Lord knows what reason. And unfortunately, Rosa Luxemburg was killed at the end of it, but she spent every single day of her life dedicated to fighting. And the reason that she actually dies in the end, spoiler warning, is because she stays in Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, when other people tell her to flee, and she's like, no, if she stayed in Berlin, she would not be like Rosa Luxemburg, the famous revolutionary that we know today. Kate Evans is a great writer for including all of the humanizing elements of that. There are even love letters written by Rosa Luxemburg in this book. Rosa Luxemburg's romantic life was actually genuinely important to her as a person, and it definitely, once again, takes somebody who is looked at as a mythical great person of history and puts them in a context where all of a sudden they're human and you have to look at them that way.
I feel like seeing people's romance for whatever reason makes people feel so much more connected to whoever you're talking about. That might sound weird to me, but I feel like adding in that humanity to them, because it's so easy to think of these historical figures as just utilities, almost just utilities to get us to where we are now, as if they weren't people. Kate
Evans does a great job at making a narrative out of the revolutionary life of Rosa Luxemburg, all of her very minute details about being disabled, being from Poland, a country where Jews were brutally persecuted at the time, her relationship with Paul Levi, I don't really know how to pronounce it. I couldn't gush about this book enough, so that's it. Red Rosa, last book.
So I've never read any of those books. Which one should I read first? Would you recommend?
Okay, the two that I would recommend are definitely Asada and Autobiography, because, first off, because we live in the United States, but also just because it's just that fantastic. And then the other one I would maybe recommend is, especially to people who aren't familiar with Marxism that much, Why Marx Was Right. In conclusion, read yourself a book, fall in love with it. Thank you to my wonderful sister for helping me out with the lighting, the filming, the audio, the everything.
In conclusion, only read Harry Potter, and that's the only book you ever need to read.
Yes, I am going to make many more videos, yes, including that one. I just had to try out the new setup real quick. Find me on Twitter, it's Simba. Find me on YouTube at Young Simba. Hit subscribe to join the pride, ding that bell, and I wish you well.